through the corporate world for a period of time now, and now you're in a position where you're managing a part of the business essentially. What would you say? What skill set is important, especially for people who are maybe a bit earlier on in their career, who are trying to navigate this corporate world and be as successful as they can be? What kind of a skill set do you feel is important?
So it depends on the state of play, and what I mean by that is, if you work at a big organization, obviously it's slightly different, because the bigger the organization, the likelihood the politics are going to be slightly different. But one thing remains true. I think if you are coming into the corporate world, you fundamentally have to be brave, right? You have to be brave with, if you're in a client-facing role, you have to be brave with clients. But you also, from an internal perspective, have to be brave with building networks, right? In most occupations, your network is going to be very much instrumental in your success or your failure. So being brave, like my favorite phrase or the sort of mantra that I live by is like, do something every day that scares you, right? Whether it's that conversation you've been putting off, it can be small. Again, I harken back to what I was saying before, like these things don't have to be grand. Nothing you ever want to achieve has to be these big things. So similarly, do something every day which scares you. Have that awkward conversation, send that awkward email, do that 9-minute plank, like whatever it is, right? Like do something which scares you every single day. And I think you should apply that same thing to like meeting people in the organizations that you work in, because your network does become your net worth, so to speak, in a corporate sense. So being brave is the number one thing. Being open is another thing, right? Like you go into a completely different culture, and I think the sort of natural bodily reaction or mental reaction is to try and find things which are very, very familiar, people who are familiar. And if you don't find that quite quickly, you automatically think you and this unknown entity are never going to have anything in common. When in reality, this is just like traveling to a country you've never been to before, and a culture that's completely alien to yours. If you go there with an open mind, you can often find that nothing is really ever as bad as it seems. Now, there are some awful companies with awful cultures, but speaking from my personal experience, I happen to work for a company which has a fucking phenomenal culture in many respects. Like, like everything down to like the name badge is being big, so you can speak to people by their first name and meet people and send people messages and stuff. So, I am aware of the fact that not every organization is like that, but I do think that where there is inconsistencies between organizations and inconsistencies between people, you can remain the constant, and you should remain the constant. And again, going back to what I say about taking control of what you can control, being open to people's different experiences, speaking to people from different walks of life has always been the lifeblood of having a wholesome, well-rounded life. And that should apply to the corporate world as well, no matter how alien it seems. Because the reality is that if you are black and working in the financial sector, or you're working in, any sector in the UK, right? Like chances are you're probably going to be in the minority. So you can't keep jumping from place to place to place, hoping that you one day become the majority, because it's likely not going to happen in certain cultures in certain countries, unless you go to Nigeria, unless you go to Ghana or whatever, right? So being open is another thing I would say. And then fundamentally as well, just like working hard. And I need to be very, very clear. I'm trying to work towards a world where we don't have to work harder, right? But for sure, we need to work hard, because it's always been about performance when it comes to business, right? Like, and we need to ensure that when they're doing the appraisals and they're cutting up the checks and all this other stuff, that we are making the best account of ourselves, and we are feeding into an ecosystem of this big body of middle class to upper class black families that I hope for in this utopia that's in my mind.
Is that what